Hello everyone and welcome back. The last days, the end time, Armageddon. Many journalists have evoked these terms in recent years to emphasize how dire conditions are in our world. We see nuclear proliferation, terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, disease outbreaks, weather disasters, arms races, moral decay, economic implosion. Study the facts on any of these threats, and you yourself may actually begin to wonder, am I living in the last days? Why do people so commonly mention those phrases, the last days, the end of time? Many people use these terms disparagingly. But where did these concepts even come from in the first place? The reason people use these terms to describe modern global catastrophes is because the Bible uses these terms to describe modern global catastrophes. Now, most people who toss these terms about don't read or believe the Bible, but the fact remains, when journalists take an honest look at the world around us, what they see is strikingly similar to what's described in the Bible. So, is it possible? Could we be living in the last days? Are we actually living in the last days described by the Bible? Most people would immediately answer, surely not. And some of the evidence that they might put forward would be, well, we've never seen any supernatural heavenly signs, or we've not yet heard the voice of God thundering from the heavens. This generation, they might say, has not even experienced a world war. So because the biblical tribulation has not happened yet, neither is it about to happen. That's what many people assume. But let's step back and just broaden the scope and look at what's been happening in our world just in the last decade or so. Back in 2004, there was the devastating earthquake and the massive tsunami that killed 230,000 people in Indonesia. It's easy for us to carry on with our lives and to forget about that. But Indonesia hasn't forgotten. The year after that, in 2005, Hurricane Katrina plowed into the United States. And of course, the U.S. is a first world country, supposedly immune to so much suffering. And that killed 1,800 people. In 2006, switching over to the Middle East, the powder keg of the world, really, in so many ways. It erupted in war. Israel warred against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then the following year you had Hamas and Fatah go to war with each other and then turn their sights on Israel. Israel that year, 2007, remember, bombed Syria's nuclear facility. And some analysts said that that strike nearly started World War III. In 2008, there was an earthquake in China that killed close to 70,000 people. I mean, that's another breathtaking loss of human life. That same year, Russia invaded Georgia. Iran conquered Lebanon. Germany conquered Kosovo. The United States, remember, deposed the leader of Pakistan, a nuclear-armed country. Of course, the biggest news in 2008 was the U.S. economy coming within just a few minutes of a total meltdown. The New York Post said the market was just 500 trades away from Armageddon. There's that term again. According to the New York Times, the American financial system was sliding from grim toward potentially apocalyptic. That's not the Bible describing those events. Again, these are journalists. These are newsmen. describing the events of 2008. Now, since that time, America has tried to keep itself afloat by borrowing and printing trillions of dollars, and all the other world economies tied to the fate of America are watching nervously. In 2009, the European Union adopted the Lisbon Treaty as its new constitution, and then it immediately plunged into an economic crisis. And since then, what have we seen in Europe? We've seen Germany rise as the dominant economic and now political force on the entire continent. In 2010, just as we have been predicting for so many years, Iraq fell to Iran. That same year, the US dollar came under assault. And America, since that time, really it was happening before 2010, but that year in particular, we really saw the relationship between America and Israel just fall apart. And today, in 2015, it's much worse. Britain also, back then, surrendered its military sovereignty. That same year, 2010, the Associated Press called that year the year that the earth struck back, just because of all of the so-called natural disasters. You had the worst flooding in Australian history, a biblical disaster, according to the Courier Mail in Brisbane, and then another devastating earthquake in New Zealand. You had the tsunami in Japan that killed almost 16,000 people. You had the American South getting hit by a wave of tornadoes. In one case, there were 312 tornadoes in just one day. Just one day. That was more than double the previous record. In 2011, if you remember all the coverage at the Trumpet.com and in our Trumpet magazine, the bloody Arab Spring that was just tossing governments out the door across the Middle East and North Africa. Iran's position in the region just growing stronger and stronger. In 2012, the European Union hit Iran with an oil embargo. Tensions between these two powers have been building even up to this day, where you have the recent terrorist attack in France. Tensions have been building. Of course, who can forget the attack on the American compound in Benghazi? A shameful, shameful response from America in return. Really no response. That same year, North Korea successfully launched a rocket into orbit. There were more mass shootings in America. In 2013, North Korea tested another nuclear bomb. Revelations about America's surveillance programs started pouring out. Terrorists killed 70 people at a mall in Kenya. Terrorists bombed the Boston Marathon. A killer murders a dozen people at the Washington Navy Yard. And then last year, 2014, we heard all about ISIS rising in Iraq and Syria, actually announcing itself a caliphate. Russia annexed Crimea. They shot down the passenger jet just last summer. Remember that over the Ukraine? The U.S. opens diplomatic relations with Cuba, of all nations. And then more recently, here in Britain, the UK, Scotland, just very nearly voted to dismember the United Kingdom from the inside out. And just more generally speaking, throughout this past decade, we've seen a handful of trends continue unabated. The spread of terrorism, for example, the rise of Iran, the rise of Germany, the political coercion by the Catholic Church, the moral, economic, and political weakening of Britain, the Commonwealth, of course, the United States. So as I say, there's nothing really to debate here. It's just a basic timeline of facts. But the question is, are these normal times in which we are living? Or are we living in what the Bible calls the last days? And The Bible is a fascinating book. Its writings have lasted for millennia, and the entire Western world is linked to the Bible on some level or another. This is a book that has changed lives. It's a book that shaped history. You just think about some of these things. I mean, surely the Bible, we've talked about this in recent programs, but it's the most unusual and unique book in world history to have been compiled over centuries by all these different authors in all these different circumstances and in different languages, to have a unified message throughout, and to be so influential among so many nations, nations that aren't even Hebrew-speaking nations or Greek-speaking nations, in the case of the New Testament. I mean, there's something about this book that's incredibly unique and powerful. Now, maybe you think it's all just thousands of years of happenstance and superstition, but what if it isn't? Among those who do view the Bible positively, many don't actually read it. Few will venture into its prophecies, even though you have to cut off a third of the entire book. If you don't read prophecy, then a third of the book is out the window. And then what about the commandments of the book, the laws of the Bible? Few people will ever let the Bible dictate to them what is right and what is wrong in their lives. But many people do at least recognize the temporary nature of human life, and they recognize that we human beings commit evil actions. They see it. We see it. Everyone sees it. We see it on the news. And many people recognize a need for salvation. And some of them even recognize that salvation is in the teachings of Jesus Christ. Even if you're not among those, you have to admit that basic, fundamental foundations of our Western society are inextricably tied to the Bible and to the revolutionary teachings Jesus Christ brought to this earth 2,000 years ago. The supremacy of law, the judicial system, morality, virtues, the elemental role of family, the entire idea of human relationships, depending on a higher law rather than force. It's all tied to this book. It's all tied to that man that proclaimed a message about family, a message about a soon coming kingdom. And it's this man, this Son of God, as he said, who talked about the end of days. It's this man, Jesus Christ, that spent so much of his ministry projecting ahead, projecting forward, telling his disciples about the end of this age and the beginning of a new age. This is not some wild-eyed prophet that nobody took seriously. Jesus Christ spoke about the very days that we're living in right now. We'll show you more on that when we come back.
Are we living in the last days? Some dismiss the notion as fanatical, but world leaders and news analysts are issuing warnings that are becoming more and more dire. Could Bible prophecies about the last days actually be accurate? Our brochure can help guide you through the relevant news and history and help you compare these events to what the Bible says. Are we living in the last days? This brochure is available for free right now at thetrumpet.com.
So let's look at the Bible to see what Jesus Christ said about this time period, the days that we're living in right now. We're going to begin in Luke 21, and as we read through some of these verses, and again, please read along, but as we read through some of these verses, you compare it to some of the things that you see on the evening news or that you read about on your news app or on the internet. Compare it to what's happening in your world. This is Luke 21, beginning in verse 28, it says, "And when those things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draws near. So here Jesus Christ is forecasting that he would return. And notice he's telling his disciples to look for certain things. When these things come to pass, when you see these things happen, then you'll know that we're getting close. Now, he didn't mean for us to know the exact day or the hour, but he certainly meant for us to anticipate this event, the greatest event in the history of the universe. I mean, and again, this is coming from Jesus Christ. So many people in the religious world just look at Jesus Christ only as a sacrifice. They don't see him as a great prophet. They don't see him as one that prophesied of the end time, that prophesied of these days that we're living in right now. Let's just look over at 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy 3. It's amazing when you think about what Jesus said there in Luke 21, or you compare it to the companion passage in Matthew 24. You put it together with what the Apostle Paul said over here in 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 3, and we'll start in verse 1. It says, "This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come." Perilous or dangerous times would come in the last days. Now don't let some quiet little neighborhood that maybe you live in fool you. Again, you have to keep your eyes open and watch. Watch and pray, as Jesus said. And if you're watching, then you see that danger is spreading, that the perilous days that Timothy, or that Paul talked to Timothy about here, we're living in them. Let me just take you to a quote from Herbert Armstrong. This is in a booklet that he wrote titled, "Are We in the Last Days?" And we're going to offer you this later on in the program. He said this is a prophecy, as it plainly states, for the last days. He's talking about this prophecy in 2 Timothy. "When I was a little boy," he writes, 90 years ago, those conditions were not true or escalating as they have been within the last 20 or 30 years. Now he's writing this back in the mid-1980s. He says, "The weapons have never existed in all history that could have laid all cities waste until the hydrogen bomb of some 30 years ago." He says, "How significant that this became possible only during the time while this gospel of the kingdom was going from nation to nation into all the world for a witness to all nations." He's talking about a prophecy in Matthew 24, and the significance of how that when that message was going out around the world, that at the same time you had the technology emerge that allowed man to actually kill off the human race. Because if you look at that prophecy, I don't know if we'll have time to go over there, in Matthew 24, if you look at that prophecy, you see that it's going to take God's divine intervention to stop man from destroying himself. That's what it says over in Matthew 24. Let's stay here, though, in 2 Timothy and read verse 2. It says, "For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy." Paul's describing human nature. I mean, it's always been this way in a sense, but as he brings out in this passage, one thing that you can look for in these latter days is you can look for human nature to just get worse and worse and worse. And we certainly have seen that. You compare this with other passages in the Bible. Jeremiah 17 comes to mind, just about the sick nature of the human mind, human nature in all of its ugly colors, described here in 2 Timothy 3, verse 3. He says, "Without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good." See, without even the natural kind of affection that you would expect there to be between spouses or within families, even that is disappearing. There's so much division and variance and hatred and strife, even down to individual households, families. Certainly you see it between nations, between religions. You see it in Britain today. You see it in the United States today. Verse 4 it says traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof, from such turn away. This is a perfect description of our world today. There may be an outward show of goodness here and there, or an outward show of religious living, but look beneath the surface. Where do you see in society today the Bible or God having authority over our lives, over our nations, over our families? So many people, even those that claim to be religious, will at the very same time deny, as it says here, the authority of the Bible and reject the prophecies about Christ's return, for example. You see so much of that. This world's filled with churches, and yet where do you hear the true message that Jesus Christ proclaimed about the soon coming kingdom of God? Where do you hear it? You just don't hear it today. Here he goes on down in verse 7, ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. That word ever means at all times. I mean, just always learning, one generation after another. And here in these last few generations, we've seen this tremendous upsurge in materialistic knowledge, an explosion of knowledge. And yet, right along with it, you see mankind drifting further and further from the truth. You see these dangerous times intensifying, perilous days. That's the great paradox that Mr. Armstrong often talked about. That's the great paradox that he talks about in that little booklet. Are we in the last days? The fact that you have this explosion of knowledge and this explosion simultaneously of violence and division and strife. Down in verse 13, he says, but evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. See, that's where it talks about it just intensifying, worsening as we draw closer to the end of this age. I mean, this is describing our day today. People can go and bury their heads in the sand if they choose, but this is an apt description of the society around you. Let's just go over to Matthew 24, see if we have enough time to squeeze in a few more verses from what Jesus himself said. Matthew 24, as I said, this is a good companion chapter to what we read over in Luke just a moment ago. We'll start in verse 3. Matthew 24, verse 3. It says, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of your coming, and of the end of this world? Tell us when these things are going to unfold. Give us a sign. Show us when the end of this world comes. Now, they weren't asking there about the end of this earth physically, or the destruction of the earth. Some scientists will warn about that. The Bible doesn't. The Bible talks about the end of this age, of man's rule over man, of Satan's rule over this earth. The Bible does definitely talk about that coming to an end. Jesus himself, as I said, a great prophet, did prophesy about the destruction of this age. Not the destruction of all humankind, although in this passage down in verse 22, it does say that we get awfully close to that. I mean, that's a frightening thing to think on, what it says there in Matthew chapter 24. But you go back to what the disciples are inquiring about here. Jesus had every opportunity. He had every opportunity to stop the disciples right in their tracks, right then and there, and to say, look, hey, don't get so caught up in prophecy. I mean, just look at me as the sacrifice. Just talk about a message of love and peace, and that's it. Instead, he goes on and answers their question, and he gives them a specific listing of events. You look for this to happen before I return to this earth. You watch for this. And God's disciples, Christ's disciples today, follow that same trajectory. They're watching world events, He says in verse 4, and Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. This is talking about that first horseman of the apocalypse. It's talking about religious deception. Many would come and deceive many millions of people, deceive them about the truth. Verse 14 is this verse that Mr. Armstrong referred to about the gospel going out. It says, And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. See, the end in this case is talking about the end of a work or an era, not the end of this age of man, as it talks about in verse 3. The gospel would go out to all the world, and then that era would end, and a new era would come on the scene, a Laodicean era, as it's called in Revelation 3, an era of lukewarmness, an era where most of God's people fall away from the truth and turn to these other pagan ideas, deceptions, false doctrines, heresy. Down in verse 21, it says, For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And then it says, And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Let me just conclude with one quote from Are We in the Last Days? God is not going to intervene or send Jesus Christ to set up a better civilization and the wonderful, happy, peace-loving world tomorrow until humanity and its leaders have had to admit their utter failure in providing peaceful, happy, and useful lives on this earth. It says, even today, most people in the Western world do not want to hear much about God. They want God to keep Himself out of their lives. Well, God's about to put Himself right in the center of things, but only after man learns this lesson and sees the futility of human reasoning. We'll offer you this booklet here at the end of the program, but that's all the time that we have to go into this subject. There's much, much more to study, so be sure that you listen to all of the information coming up here and request the literature that we have offered today. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time